kọjọba Èkó ọba ní dàbàrò ọba ní Akíṣemọ́yìn ọba ní ológun kùtèrè ọba ní Adélé Àjọsùn ọba ní Ẹ̀sìnlógún ọba ní Ìdéwú Òjòdàrí ọba ní ló súnmú. Ọba ni. Ọba lóye kan. Ọba ni. Ọba lè ṣùgbà yìí. Ọba ni. Ọba bá lòlù. Ọba ni. Ilé Mùsàlíkù. Ọba ni. Adéyìnmí ká òye kan. Ọba ni. Sule Àdìsá. Ọba ni. Sule Àdìsá ọmọ ọba ni. Bọ́ba bá kàn, a ó jẹ́ èèyàn lórí méjèèjì ara ìyàgbọ́. Ọmọ ọba ni.
Báwa ṣe kò lè yẹ gbogbo wa kalẹ̀ o.
Èkó, Èkó akéde, Èkó,
Èkó akéde,
Èkó,
Èkó akéde, Èkó ilé ọkàn rárá tẹ̀tẹ̀ náà máa jọ o. Tata bàbá Ajégúnlẹ̀, títí dé èbúté mẹ́ta. Tata bàbá Ajégúnlẹ̀, títí dé èbúté mẹ́ta. Títí dé Sómólú, títí dé Ìdíòrò. Gànàgẹ̀rẹ̀ dọ́lọ́run ṣògo. Ẹni bá dẹ́kun dẹ́kun aróyìn ọ̀rẹ́ mi dẹ́kun. Ìjọba ṣe kì í ṣàtìjẹ pẹ̀lú rògbò. Kẹ̀kẹ́ pẹ́pẹ́ rẹ̀ dẹ́kun lè dẹ́kun ọ̀rẹ́ mi. Tóbi débùté mẹ́ta ọmọ wí dé lówó. Tóbi dẹ́bà náà kọ́rin dẹ́kun ajé sojú bẹ̀.
ṣùgbọ́n kẹ́ má gbàgbé àdúgbò wẹ́wẹ́wẹ́ tó kù sẹ́yìn.
Ẹ̀pin kó kárí ara mi dẹ́kun ìjọba wa.
àwa ń gbádùn tí ọba olókùn yìí gbanágbaná.
Bàbá bàbá Ajégúnlẹ̀, títí dé èbúté mẹ́ta. Bàbá bàbá Ajégúnlẹ̀, títí dé èbúté mẹ́ta. Títí dé Sómólú, títí dé Ìdíòrò. Gànàgẹ̀rẹ̀ dọ́lọ́run ṣògo. Ohun owó tẹ.
Gànàgẹ̀rẹ̀ dọ́lọ́run ṣògo.
Ohun owó tẹ.
Gànàgẹ̀rẹ̀ dọ́lọ́run ṣògo.
Ohun ajé tẹ.
Gànàgẹ̀rẹ̀ dọ́lọ́run ṣògo.
Ohun owó tẹ.
wọ́n kéré wọ́n kéré wọ́n kéré wọ́n wẹ́wẹ́ wọ́n tíntín wọ́n bíntín wọ́n sùn mọ́ àwọn ọmọdé wọ̀nyí sùn mọ́ sí nọ́mbà wa wọ́n kéré sí nọ́mbà wa.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you very much, dear colleagues from LSA. And hello, hi, Ruth, hi, Janet, and I don't know, I think you have Tunde's name. I think Tunde, I sent around his own link, so I also logged in as Tunde for the first time. You should have received a link from LSA directly, which basically says hi and then your name, and with the link, and then you can join as, oh, perfect. Or you can just change it there. Perfect.
I think I just did that.
Yes, Ruth, you're just sharing your screen, but we see your desktop.
Okay, now I've stopped sharing.
Yeah, you can also start and just quickly share your PowerPoint or share your PDF. And thank you. I just received your email for backup in case anything goes wrong.
Okay. Voila.
Perfect. And would you like to go to full screen mode for a second? Perfect. Wonderful. Okay, all works well. Thank you.
Do you want me to try now, Vera?
Perfect. Yes. Please.
Okay.
Thank you, Janet. Wonderful. Yes,
Okay.
perfect. Also full screen. Yes, all visible. Thank you. And Eleanor, perhaps.
Yeah, sure. Let me just try. Does that work?
Yes. And would you like to start to also quickly try showing it full screen? We show
yeah.
it in, yeah. Yeah, perfect. Okay, wonderful. All visible. I think I'll write a quick email to Ivana. It's so wonderful to have you here. It's, you know, this is really a chain. So you're of course also very welcome to join any of the follow-up sessions. We will continue until Saturday. It's it's a big program. And yes, very much looking forward to your talks, very, very much. And really wonderful that this is happening and that we are connected across countries, across continents. From where are you at the moment joining us? Where are you based at the moment physically? Which time zone?
I'm in Cambridge, so
Oh,
same time zone, not very exciting.
Oh, okay. Janet, are you in Chicago?
I'm back in Chicago for a couple
hi,
of days.
can you hear me?
Yes, so 9 a.m.
Oh,
me.
okay.
So, good morning, yes. And thank you so much for putting all these sessions together. I'm looking forward to all of the papers. It's
We're
wonderful.
really excited. Thank you so much for participating. Hi, Tunde. Yes, we can hear you. We cannot, yes,
Hi.
now we can also see you. Hi,
All
wonderful.
right. Sorry about that. I had issues with my connection. So I had with my Wi-Fi. By the way, I'm in Nigeria. I'm in Lagos, Nigeria. So the connection is not so strong. So I was struggling with the connection, but now I'm back on.
Okay, wonderful. I'm glad it worked out. I just received an email from Ivana Tunde that she doesn't manage to log in with the link. Are you in CC?
Oh,
Do you also?
I use the same link, and that's the same link I sent to everybody about 3 minutes ago.
Yeah, that's your personal link. So I will write to her that she has to use her own link, because when we use your link, we join as you. So it happened to me too at the beginning. I joined as as Tunde Babalola. No problem.
Oh,
it's kind of sometimes happens.
Sorry about that. I didn't know that's what they've done. I just wanted to be sure everybody has the link, because they've been sending so many emails. I guess maybe it's already kind of, people may not really find it easily in their emails.
Okay, but Ivana is here, exactly, but she's among the audience. LSA help, could you please bring Ivana Dizdar from University of Toronto, who's at the moment in the audience section, to the speakers discussant section, please. She kind of ended up in the wrong.
Yeah.
There's someone from LSA hearing us.
I just sent her an email to look for the LSA. Oh, there she is. Okay, good.
Yes, wonderful. Thank you so much, LSA. Wonderful.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi, Ivana.
I'm so sorry about that. I was waiting for 15 minutes in the other link, and I started to think maybe something was wrong.
I didn't. I
No,
didn't
no,
check
it's okay.
the audience room.
No worries at all. I'm glad I'm
Yeah.
here. 2 minutes late, but here I am. Nice to meet you all.
Would you also, no, it's
Yeah,
a
thank you
pleasure.
so
We're very
much.
much looking forward to your talk. Would you like to briefly test sharing your screen?
Yes, definitely.
So can the audience hear us right now, or they are just still?
Does that work?
You can also go to full screen, please. One
Sure.
second. So test this too. Perfect. Wonderful.
Great.
All visible, works well. Great. So the tech side is, that's
Awesome.
great.
All right. All right. Thank you, everyone, for. So can we start, Vera?
Yes. Everything works
All
technically.
right.
Thank you.
Okay. So thank you, everyone, for being part of our panel, the materiality of everyday life in Africa, multi-disciplinary perspective. In this panel, we have 5 sections, as for those who are not aware of that. So this is not the only panel on this. This is not the only session on this panel. We have 4 other sessions, 2 tomorrow and 2 on Saturday. So we urge you to follow us in all of these panels where we have very intriguing and exciting papers. My colleague and I, Vera and I, we're so happy and welcome all the panelists to this panel. We have 4 panelists today. The presentation will follow. We have it on the program. That means Ivana will be going first, who will be talking on the Beyond the Looking Glass, Gender, Material, and Interiority in the work of Jermaine Anta-Gibai. You can share your screen now while I read your bio. Ivana is a historian of art, architecture, and design. She studies the intersection of visual culture and geopolitics from the 19th century to the present. She is a Joseph Ahmed Ambadia Doctoral Fellow in Art History at the University of Toronto and a curatorial assistant at the National Gallery of Canada, Ottawa. She graduates with master's degree in art history and the curatorial studies from the Sorbonne and the Columbia University. Dr. has spoken at New York University, Princeton University, MIT, Trinity College, Dublin, and the INACO Paris, among others. Welcome me in joining Ivana for our presentation.
Thank you very much to both of you and everyone who's here. Can you hear me properly and everything's okay? Awesome. And yeah. I should mention, I changed my topic. I originally proposed something different, and in the process, in the past few months, my research has kind of pivoted a little bit toward postage stamps. So that's what I'll be talking about today. I think it's actually even more relevant to the theme of the session and the theme of the conference more broadly, is this thinking about everydayness and everyday life. So I'll go ahead with this topic.
I'm sorry. Yeah, I remember you changed your title. Apparently, I have the old one, and I actually forgot that you changed your title. I'm sorry about that.
No, it's great. Now everyone knows that the other thing I'm working on at the same time. So maybe I'll present that elsewhere soon. Thanks. So postage stamps, as I've said, have struck me as a particularly compelling form at the crossroads of applied art, mass media, and international communication. Stamps fascinate me in part because of their ambiguous status as artistic objects, semiotic carriers, educational tools, political instruments, and archives. My interest is guided by a set of foundational questions. What do the aesthetics of correspondence tell us about a society? What do they tell us about a people's history and their futures? How do they reflect and possibly inform a nation's evolving politics? Recently, my research has taken up the iconography of postage stamps in Ghana around the year 1957, when the country gained independence from British rule. I'm interested in how these important yet understudied elements of everyday life intersected with nationhood, Pan-Africanism, citizenship, freedom, and liberation. Considering the theme of this panel and the conference, as I mentioned, there's much to be said about the everydayness of postage stamps and how they figured as an ideological tool, as forces within the drive for independence, and as forms for asserting a new post-colonial identity. The first modern postage stamp, issued in 1840, boasted Queen Victoria's face in full profile. This became convention. British stamps would almost always depict the face of the reigning monarch. Even after British stamps introduced the representation of West African scenes in the mid-20th century, this imagery was typically overshadowed by the royal bust. In Britain and across Europe, postage stamps were much more than bureaucratic units signifying the amount of postage paid. Early French stamps, for instance, featured French dignitaries, explorers, and conquerors. Soon, African imagery permeated French stamp design, with the inclusion of African plants and animals, natural resources, and so-called ethnic types. Constructing a detailed picture of colonial empires, territories, and encounters, postage stamps as a category of visual culture played a crucial role in the projects of imperialism and colonization. In the Gold Coast, which would become Ghana following independence, the first stamps were issued in 1875. Until 1902, Gold Coast stamps largely featured the profile of the Queen, Victoria, often gazing to the left as if surveying Africa's west coast. Even a century later, when African imagery from talking drums to surf boats had begun to appear in the stamps, colonial figures and themes of colonial authority continued to dominate postage design. A Gold Coast stamp produced in 1848, for instance, depicts a relatively large portrait of King George VI, overlooking a nameless African farmer harvesting cocoa below. By virtue of its composition and the disparate scale of the two figures, the stamp projects an image of the hierarchical relationship between Britain and its colony. From 1875 through 1957, Gold Coasters saw mostly symbols of imperial rule on the nation's postage stamps. By the mid-20th century, and the Gold Coast and elsewhere, this would change dramatically. Well aware of stamps' capacity to shape the public imagination and to influence a nation's political trajectory, anti-colonial activists employed postage stamps as an anti-colonial tool. As colonized territories across Africa, but also Asia and Latin America, fought for and gained independence, the design and production of stamps became a means of documenting, legitimating, and impacting campaigns for sovereignty. Ideologically motivated, the carefully constructed iconography of postage stamps played an invariably and undeniably significant role as new nations sought to represent and assert themselves as independent states. In the Gold Coast, this action was inextricably linked with Kwame Nkrumah, a nationalist leader who successfully led the nation's fight to end British rule. Conscious of the intersections between the political and the visual, Nkrumah made postage design an important part of his governance. In collaboration with advisors and artists, his government conceived, designed, and disseminated a new image of Ghana. On the first of the stamps, Nkrumah's face has replaced the face of the Queen. And I'll talk about this soon. In 1957, Nkrumah wrote, "Many of my people cannot read or write. They've got to be shown that they are now really independent, and they can only be shown by signs. When they buy stamps, they will see my picture, an African like themselves, and they will say, hey, look, here is my leader on the stamps. We are truly a free people." From 1957 to 1966, during his tenure as the leader of Ghana, Nkrumah's government employed 24 graphic designers to create over 200 postage stamps. They actively deliberated about what should and should not be represented. Some insisted on the importance of cultural themes, chiefs, pelicans, and skins, for instance. Others wanted to emphasize the economic symbols, iconography depicting raw materials, active production, and sources of major revenue in Ghana, particularly cocoa and timber, as well as the mining, agriculture, and fishing industries. In a stamp issued in 1958, two men bring 4 giant logs together, as if about to load and transport them. Above the action is Ghana's flag, and below the action is the word Ghana, a visual statement reflecting the fact that timber and logging were at the center, quite literally here, of the nation's industry and profit. Nkrumah had aspirations for the rapid industrialization of Ghana. This, he believed, would be the basis for economic independence and modernization. Stamps produced in this period often illustrate themes of nature, culture, and production, flora and fauna, sports, folklore, and natural resources, while others are explicitly political. A stamp in 1961 for Africa Freedom Day showed a dozen African national flags orbiting around the continent. A commemorative stamp in 1966 featured an eagle flying with Ghana's flag in its wings. Various stamps commemorated the 24th February Revolution with soldiers and nationals marching, raising fists and waving flags. In 1968, Human Rights Year stamps portrayed figures near and far, from Ghana's founding fathers to figures of the civil rights movement in the United States. And these examples give a sense of the broad range of imagery the stamps would disseminate, promoting and instilling a sense of pride in not only the country's production infrastructure and industry, but also ideas of nationalism, Pan-Africanism, and internationalism. Art, both fine and applied, was a point of fascination for Nkrumah. In his autobiography, first published in 1957, he touches specifically on his fascination with philately. Indeed, the nationalist thinker and leader had a profound interest in the iconography of postage stamps. He understood their power as objects that carried images, disseminating political and ideological messages across borders. During Nkrumah's tenure as the leader of Ghana, the government issued countless stamps featuring symbols of African liberation and independence. Subjects are presented including anniversaries like National Founders Day and Africa Freedom Day, important industrial ventures like the Volta River Project, and occasions like the first Conference of Independent African States and the Conference of Non-Aligned Countries in Belgrade. The stamps, of course, were produced to be seen by Africans, but also non-Africans. In 1955, government officials of the Gold Coast had established a committee that would deliberate on the soon-to-be new nation's first postage stamp. The committee assembled for the first time in September of 1955, meeting at the Ministry of Communications. It was inaugurated to deliberate on national stamp designs, including a special set of stamps to be launched on Independence Day, to issue permanent stamps to replace colonial stamps, and to recommend artists for commission. With Independence Day approaching, Nkrumah's government faced a unique challenge. The release of a postage stamp by a formerly colonized African territory was unprecedented, which left the committee with no African example to look to. With the exception of South Asian countries formerly colonized by Britain, Ghana was the first, and certainly the first in Africa, to tread the territory of postage design. The Postage Stamps Committee was made up of British colonial officials and nationals of Ghana alike. Notably, its membership included Kofi Antubam, a state artist. Antubam would become one of Ghana's, indeed Africa's, most established artists and an important stamp designer. His prominence as an artist, his skill as a designer, and his interest in heritage and symbolism made Antubam particularly well positioned to contribute to Nkrumah's ongoing project of creating a distinctive national identity for Ghana. Antubam recognized and capitalized on the power of graphic design as a means to promote a spirit of Ghanaian and Pan-African solidarity. In 1962, he would write that stamps are a marvelous means of transmitting ideas to vast numbers of people, of educating them. The Postage Stamp Committee did not deliberate without disagreement. Iconography, composition, color, scale, and text were all subjects of debate. Committee members were not aligned regarding to what extent the general public should have a hand in the selection of themes, and they disagreed about from where stamps should draw inspiration. After several submissions and revisions by Antubam, a design was approved for Ghana's first commemorative stamp. On the left, we see the outline of the African continent. Ghana is outlined and shaded, and above it in bolded capitals, the word Ghana proclaims both its place and its significance. Partly overlaying the cartographic image, an eagle is depicted in mid-flight, its wings, it seems, spread as wide as possible. The eagle flies toward the top right corner of the composition, toward the image of a man. Contained within an oval frame within the stamp's own frame, a kind of vignette, is the face of Nkrumah. His expression is hard to read. We might describe him as serious or casual, nervous or relaxed, assured or puzzled. He looks not at us, but beyond us, into the distance, as if toward the future. A traditional symbol, the eagle held a deep significance on the Gold Coast, popularized in part by James Agre, one of the nation's most famed intellectuals, who had written the proverb, "My people of Africa, we were created in the image of God, but men have made us think that we are chickens, and we still think we are, but we are eagles. Stretch forth your wings and fly." Accordingly, the eagle in flight would symbolize opportunity and aspiration, achievement and victory, freedom and liberation. The bird would soar triumphantly from a colonial past into a post-colonial future, leaving behind an oppressive regime and gliding toward a family of independent nation states. The image seems to suggest the eagle has flown out of the shaded patch out of Ghana and is now flying across all of Africa. It attests to Ghana's place as the first nation to break free from colonial rule, but implies it will not be the last. The bird, a symbol of freedom, flies over the continent from west to east, as though spreading the promise of freedom to Ghana's African neighbors. Indeed, in his 1963 book, Africa Must Unite, Nkrumah wrote his intention had been to use the Gold Coast as a starting off point for African independence and unity. Channeling the spirit, energy, and positivity of Nkrumah's conception of African genius, Ghanaian postage stamps employed color as a crucial marker. Through color, stamps signified the sharp contrast between the Gold Coast as a territory of the British Empire and Ghana as an independent nation state. The latter palette dominates commemorative stamps produced in the period. In a stamp in honor of the 3rd anniversary of independence, for instance, fireworks against a dark night sky are depicted in red, green, and yellow. In a stamp commemorating National Founders Day, a brass medal with Nkrumah's face carved into it hangs on a ribbon in the same colors, complete with a black star. In another Founders Day stamp, a sail ship's 3 masts each boast one of the 3 respective colors. In a stamp celebrating the victory of the Black Stars in the African Soccer Cup, this is my personal favorite, a running player about to kick the ball, presumably toward the winning goal, sports a jersey with the colors across his chest. Through color and repetition, the stamps normalized the new flag, announcing and crystallizing Ghana's independence. Nkrumah and the Stamps Committee were well aware that an independent Ghana required a discrete identity, including a discrete visual identity that set it apart from both Britain and the Gold Coast, from both colonial force and colonial antecedent. Ghana's colonial history far precedes its British ties. In 1471, the Portuguese arrived at Ghana's shore, the first Europeans to settle there. Because of the land's rich deposits of gold, they named it the Gold Coast. The Portuguese and later other Europeans, Dutch, British, Swiss, Danish, French, and German, made agreements with coastal people and chiefs, obtaining land and building forts to aid their trade in precious resources such as gold, ivory, and pepper. They also traded in enslaved people, fulfilling a growing demand for slave labor in the West Indies and the so-called New World. In 1844, chiefs in present-day Ghana signed a bond that recognized the jurisdiction of Queen Victoria. And by 1886, the Gold Coast had formally become a British colony. Ghana's coastal status was a point of consideration as Nkrumah's government conceived and designed its postage stamps. In stamps produced in the period between 1957 and 1966, we often see Ghana's coastline, its connection to the Atlantic and icons of the ocean, such as ships, sailboats, fish, and the ocean itself. A coastline is a geographical edge, a place from which one can look out, board a vessel, and begin a voyage into unknown territory. Crucially, coastlines also hold an important place in histories of colonization. Shores, of course, mark first contacts of European settlers with newly discovered lands and first encounters with indigenous populations. They're likewise sites to load and unload goods, from gold to people captured and forcibly transported from coast to coast. In one of his great texts, Kobina Mercer cites Dutch historian Albert van Danzig, who refers to a long stretch of forts and castles along Ghana's coast as a unique kind of monument. He says it's the ancient shopping street of West Ghana. The metaphor of a shopping street resonates with Mercer, who recalls Walter Benjamin's arcade project. Mercer reframes Benjamin's project within a different context, namely Ghana's coastline, asking what this alternative geographic and historical setting can tell us about the birth of a global modernity. The shopping street, with Ghanaian castles and forts instead of Parisian shops, takes a different meaning. It carries the memory of the Atlantic slave trade, becoming, Mercer suggests, an anti-monument. Notably, postage stamps in Ghana issued between 1957 and 1966 omit this history. They do not represent or show traces of the slave trade, nor the violent histories imbued in colonization. Instead, they're stamps of glory, epitomizing a spirit of joy, confidence, and hope. Constructed, edited, and controlled, they offer a selective picture of Ghana's identity and history. They are monuments or micro-monuments to a continent and its collective future. As material objects, postage stamps are delicate, lacking durability, and yet their content is long-lasting, producing and reproducing in our political and cultural imagination. Despite being among the smallest of visual creations, Ghanaian stamps contain, nevertheless, the vastness of Africa and its projected image. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you, Ivana. That was so timely. I was just giving you the signal to wrap up. Yeah, we go straight to the next presenter. We're going to take all the questions after all the presenters have had the opportunity to present their paper. So keep your questions. You can start posting questions in the Q&A box here. So we take everything after. So Janet Mariam Pudi is the Million Rice Postdoctoral Curatorial Fellow in Heart of Africa at the Heart Institute of Chicago. She received her PhD in art history in 2020 from the Pennsylvania State University with focus on traditional arts and architecture of Africa. Our research examines regional vocabularies and the visual exchange system of social and the cultural trade networks throughout Eastern and the Northern Africa, the Gulf region, and Indian Ocean world, with a particular interest in the transmission of talismanic patterns and designs in their diverse protective functions across different media, including textiles, metalwork, jewelry, wood carving, and architectural adornment. She will be talking today about beyond face value, carved Swahili doors in daily life and meaning. Janet, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tunde. Following the theme of this conference, which interested me very much, everyday life in Africa, past and present, and this wonderful series of sessions organized by Tunde and Vera specifically, thank you to both. The materiality of everyday life in Africa as a multidisciplinary perspective. I will speak today about the beautiful objects at the center of my own research in East Africa and the Indian Ocean world, a corpus of ornamentally carved wooden doors of the Swahili coast, and the insights and meanings revealed when they are examined beyond face value as part of everyday life. How are they understood by those who see them or pass by them every day? And what tangible or intangible beliefs are linked to their compositions? Oops. Okay. As an art historian, this is an example of the result of close looking, specifically at the placement of compositional designs and constructed elements on the doorways, but in the context of everyday use, especially the way people physically engage with the space in them, around them, through them, and how that underscores the role of the doors as gateways between public and private worlds, as protective devices at a point of spiritual vulnerability, and religious expressions of longstanding beliefs and traditions. For those not familiar, the Swahili coast is this narrow strip marked in brown of land that runs along the coastline from Mogadishu down to northern Mozambique and Madagascar, and includes all the islands and archipelagos in between. And I have spent the majority of my time on Nguja Island, more popularly known as Zanzibar, indicated here with the orange arrow, which for centuries was one of the most important commercial centers in the Indian Ocean. And my multi-sided comparative visual research also extends necessarily to closely examine doors and histories throughout the Swahili coast, around the Indian Ocean rim, including the Arabian Peninsula and northwestern India so far, and into the East African hinterlands. Because as you can see on this map, Zanzibar and the Swahili polities were long involved in complex trade networks that reached far beyond their borders. These exchanges and engagements are reflected in the motifs, designs, and iconography of the carved doors, and the creative adaptations and interplays between artists and craftsmen that moved back and forth and in every direction for centuries before colonial disruptions destroyed these networks in the late 19th century. The extant carved wooden doors of the Swahili coast have long been considered iconic artifacts, admired by locals and visitors as visual manifestations of the region's complex roots and histories. With their role in that long history of rich exchange, artists of the Swahili coast are revered throughout Eastern and Southern Africa, the Indian Ocean Rim, and beyond for their innovative approach, for what they themselves refer to as their own special design cocktail, which draws fully from the global and visual arsenal that has been fueling their creative output and innovation for so many centuries. Despite that, the perspectives, assumptions, and observations recorded by British officers and other government officials in the colonial area, along with a few brief mentions in other foreign accounts, have dominated and driven discourses and popular traditions and knowledge about Swahili doors. Touted as prestige objects, their forms are primarily understood as literal and material expressions of the apex of power and wealth in the Western Indian Ocean that occurred when the popularity of commissioning and owning a door was also at its height. Their surfaces covered with motifs and designs that were created to reflect an owner's access to the vast streams of trade, production, and elite society that converged at his doorstep. While those definitions are an undeniable part of Swahili history, they are static characterizations that persistently obscure and flatten the door's essence to a singular moment in time, viewed through a narrow lens that robs them of fuller cultural meanings and historical and artistic value in their representations. Today, I will highlight two compositional characteristics of Swahili doors for what they elucidate about everyday engagement and local beliefs, as they also serve to decolonize this knowledge surrounding their histories, constructed through those early observations based purely on face value. This approach considers localized spiritual and material engagements with carved Swahili doors as they trace deep historical connections to visual expressions and imaginaries of creative and spiritual congruence before politically motivated discourses came to define them. Epigraphic imagery as inscriptions carved central lint. You see it right by the light bulb on, I don't know if you can see my arrow here, and then the detail is on the right. They were developed in door compositions heavily in the late 19th century in Zanzibar, and also appears on doors throughout the region. And we know that Quranic inscriptions were incorporated into decorative compositions on carved door frames for centuries in the northern Swahili coast region, evidenced by one rare extant door from the town of Siu in the Lamu archipelago in now Kenya from the 18th or 17th century. A possible explanation for the early instances of textual carvings on wooden doors may have a relationship to historical Swahili cultural practices surrounding protection at entrance points. The carvings may have evolved from an earlier tradition when pieces of paper with protective texts were pinned and attached to door frames and entryways of all types as talismans or as part of prayers. When carvers incorporate inscriptions into compositional arrangements, it is understood how they serve a protective function. The positioning of these elements is significant when they're related to points of vulnerability or to the physical act of passing through the opening of a door, as you see in this example from Mozambique Island. An inscription or protective image placed at the center point on the lintel is directly above the head. When a person looks up to that focal point upon entry, it becomes a reverent manifestation to the heavens and the performance of a prayerful act. For the few instances when lintel inscriptions are mentioned in early historical and colonial accounts, they're described mostly as a form of signage or information, a badge or monogram to indicate the name of the patron or the date of the door as it was carved. And inscriptions that include this type of information do exist on several examples around the region, and there may have been a greater number of doors with that type of descriptive inscriptions in earlier centuries. Today, though, the majority of extant doors with inscriptions incorporate iconography in overtly or abstracted auspicious forms that relate to prosperity, gratitude, protection, and devotion. They often include text at the top center with the Bismillah, verses from a surah of the Holy Quran or several of them, and quotes from the Prophet Muhammad, especially about generosity or beauty. For example, be kind, for whenever kindness becomes part of something, it beautifies it. Although the carved doors in Zanzibar were broadly understood primarily as symbols of wealth and power, this element arguably exemplifies their core function in the display of piety and the acknowledgement of God as the source of all material and spiritual gifts. As these Arabic inscriptions were increasingly incorporated into lintel compositions and became part of the standard visual program in Zanzibar, where most people spoke Swahili or another language, they were frequently abstracted or carved with flowing calligraphic characters so stylized that the writing itself became more of an icon or a symbolic mark. The text almost did not need to be legible because the majority of the audience could only recognize that the letters were Arabic and could not literally translate or read the Arabic text in the first place. They're often so abstracted that today, even Muslims fluent in Arabic and knowledgeable about Quranic passages have difficulty deciphering the inscriptions. And at the time of the creation, they were likely understood or translated for literal meanings by only a very limited audience. So when they were abstracted into the shape of a mosque or a vase, as you see here, the inscription became a recognizable mark of communication, a signifier understood by the broadest audience as part of the spiritual and religious aspects of daily life, a constant reminder as one passed by or through these doorways. And these place the Swahili doors within the broader network of apocalyptic devices and protective devices, and as another material expression related to significant everyday uses and functions. And the second compositional element is threshold boards or sills. So in the construction of many Swahili doors, the threshold is purposefully elevated. This is accomplished in one or two ways. First, the doorway opening is raised up off of the ground level at its base, sometimes cut out of the foundation at a higher point from street level, or lifted up above a stair, a step, or even baraza seating. Baraza in this context refers to a bench. You see examples right here. Hopefully you can see my cursor in here. It's a conversational seating area, a resting place, or a space for receiving guests. And it's a significant part of Swahili culture. And you can see those baraza on the right, and then the raised doorways in this image of Zanzibar Stone Town from 1900. And the second way, flat wood board in this top image, for example, a 2x4 or 2x8 inch length of lumber, stood on its shortest side to create a barrier that one must step over upon entry. The threshold is thus constructed to sit above the ground level for what are likely both practical and symbolic reasons. An elevated threshold boards that form the base support and protect the interior spaces. They prevent insects, snakes, rodents, and running water from entering the family areas and working spaces inside a structure. When they were first built centuries ago, Swahili towns were designed with exposed narrow sewer channel systems that ran along the edges of alleyways and streets. Even now during the monsoon season, the alleys and streets of Stone Town and Zanzibar almost instantly rivers of water after heavy rain. Symbolically, to pass through a doorway by crossing a threshold, especially an elevated one that requires special attention to step over an obstruction, as you can see in this image, directs attention to the present moment and creates a focus on the transition and passage from one space to another. The act and the necessary pause create a special awareness and an acknowledgement that such a passage between worlds divided in religion, mythology, and spiritual contexts occur at open and vulnerable spaces. Inscriptions and carvings on the threshold board itself are no longer common, but do underscore the significance of this liminality and transitional character of a doorway or threshold, and function as protective markers and devices in the cases where they do appear. These examples demonstrate how physical actions and daily interactions with material objects factor into their meaning and the ways they are read or understood. For the threshold boards, the fact that one must stop and look down, or at least add a short pause to his forward progress through the doorway, was an impetus for the application of talismanic carvings and decorations in all areas of the doorframe near the ground. And these imagery, these motifs that are used, relate to the connecting point between the earth and the heavens, the earth and subterranean regions, foundational objects and the sustenance of life, and other protective and liminal expressions. It's clearly worth considering the many other compositional elements integrated into doorways as design components because of this relationship to physical and protective functions and the interplay between imagery and structure or spiritual meanings and beyond. Physical uses and everyday engagements with the doorway create significant avenues toward broader historical analysis and pathways for engagement with a wide variety of other disciplines. One Swahili man explained to me that to own a beautiful door, such as this one, for example, to pass through it day in and day out is a way of honoring the beauty of the world, the talents that God gives us, and to exhibit piety and gratitude as a public-facing marker of religious faith on one's household. The people who live in these spaces are no longer the wealthy merchants or royal courtesans, but they continue to engage meaningfully with their doors day in and day out, the same way their predecessors did for centuries before colonial disruptions changed the face of their living spaces and their histories. And in the same way, that supports their rich, complex, spiritually meaningful, and intangible cultural beliefs that prevail in everyday life, to display how very important it is to look deeply beyond the face value of these iconic doors. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Janet. That's so really intriguing. I'm sure there will be questions waiting for you at the end. We go to the next presenter, who is Eleanor Stevenson. Can you please share your screen, Eleanor? Yeah, she is the recipient of the AHRC-funded collaborative PhD project with the Royal Society and the University of Cambridge, titled The Royal Society and Slavery in Jamaica, 1960 to 1730. Her PhD research focuses on understanding the links between the Royal Society and slavery in Jamaica and how, in turn, science might have enhanced the profitability of Britain's imperial enterprise. She received a MA and a BA in History of Art at the Courtauld Institute of Art, London, with focus on architectural history of the British Empire. Alongside her PhD, Eleanor is working as an assistant curator on the Legacies of Empire and Enslavement exhibition, which we opened at the Fitzwilliams Museum in Cambridge in July 2023, and is also curating a solo exhibition with a contemporary Pakistani artist opening this summer. Eleanor, the floor is yours.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much, Vera and Tade. This is really interesting so far. Okay, so today I'm going to talk to you about the cowrie currency in West Africa. The cowrie is a sea snail measuring up to 3 centimeters, found in the shallow waters of the Indian Ocean. What can this shell, the Cypria banata, tell us about the British role in the transatlantic slave trade? In West Africa, as in Asia for many centuries earlier, the cowrie shell proved an ideal currency. In the 17th century, first the Dutch and then the English East India companies realized the potential profits made from exporting cowries as ballast and ships from the Maldives to Amsterdam and London, often via Bengal. Once in European cities, these shells were auctioned to slave traders who imported them as currency to West Africa to purchase enslaved Africans. These humans, in turn, became commodities shipped to the New World. The vast geography of these commercial transactions provides an avenue through which to explore the complex economic and geographic enormity that was the Atlantic slaving system. It also marks the beginning of a globalized economy, when the cowrie held international value. This paper will focus on the biography of a single object, the cowrie shell, taking cues from theorists Apodore and Kopitov. This approach aims to demonstrate the changing role and value of the currency in West Africa, from the first moments of contact and commerce between Africans and Europeans around 1500 until colonialism in the late 1800s, and thereafter its symbolic and religious legacies. Before the cowrie shell made its commercial impact on West Africa, it had been a basic form of currency or as an object of personal adornment across the world. From the early modern period, Europeans trading in Africa realized the demand for the cowrie, specifically the small Cypria minata species. This type of cowrie, just one of 250 different types of the species, was found in abundance in the atolls of the Maldives and the Indian Ocean. The locals harvested these shells as currency to purchase rice and other commodities with the Bengalis on the mainland of the Indian subcontinent. Accounts report that European merchants purchased these shells from the Maldivians. However, given how vital these objects were for their own economies, it's highly likely that these transactions were forced. Once transported to London, these shells would have passed between merchants operating in the city, in coffee houses, the streets, and in the company headquarters. Until around 200 years ago, a short walk from the Bank of England, itself an institution with connections to slavery, would have led you to the headquarters of 3 companies connected to the cowrie currency: the East India Company, the Royal African Company, and the South Sea Company. From the early 17th century, the East India Company had a permanent residence in the city of London, which in the 1720s became East India House on Leadenhall Street, depicted in this watercolour. The East India Company began exporting cowrie shells from the Maldives in the 1660s, 20 years after the Dutch East India Company had discovered their use and demand. Once in London and Amsterdam, these cowries were auctioned to companies trading in West Africa, such as the Royal African Company, who then used the currency to purchase enslaved peoples. Between 1700 and 1790, the Dutch and English exported and imported over 10 billion shells. Further down Leadenhall Street, you would have reached Africa House, the headquarters of the Royal African Company, England's only company to hold a monopoly on the trade of enslaved people from West Africa. Initially named the Company of Royal Adventurers, the organisation received its first royal charter from King Charles II in 1660, ensuring Britain profited from the transatlantic slave trade. In 1693, under Captain Philip Thomas, the Royal African Company chartered Hannibal, a ship which transported 700 enslaved Africans from Whydah in modern-day Benin to Barbados. In his accounts of this tragic journey, almost 50% of the human cargo perished before reaching the West Indies. He published a book in 1732, and in which he wrote, I quote, "Best goods to purchase slaves are the best goods to purchase here, cowries, the more esteemed, for they pay them by tale, the smallest as valuable as the biggest, but they take from us by measure or weight, of which about 100 pounds is for a good man-slave." This disturbing account is just one of many that records the use of cowrie shells to purchase people. Thomas records the weight, which would have been measured in bags or bushels, which would have equated to approximately 10,000 shells. Like the captives, these cowries were kept in stores in the 18 trading ports along the West African coast that the Royal African Company had control over in 1709. The cowrie was just one of the currencies imported by European slave traders to West Africa. Others included glass beads, manillas, and textiles. Beyond sharing the status of being a soft currency, which basically means just losing value over time, these objects held spiritual and symbolic powers. The materialization of beads as objects of power and political capital predates European involvement. As early as the 11th century, glass beads were being produced in West Africa as insignia or decoration. This signals the rich early Africa and the subsequent European counterfeit production for African markets. These beads were hand-blown, the beads on the left, were hand-blown in Venice, imported to Britain, and then exported from, quote, Bristol for the West African slave and gold trades. Metal manillas were also manufactured in Britain and either used as currency in West Africa or melted down and spent in local economies. In his book, A Fistful of Shells, Toby Green records that among the Igbo of the Niger Delta, the copper manillas imported through Atlantic trade were not melted, in fact, but instead accumulated to enter the Powell Igbe secret society. Hoarding of manillas for these purposes is a different economic dynamic in which economic accumulation and religious power were inextricable. What was true of the Igbo and Ekbe cult was true elsewhere regarding cowries. Cowries became very important to Yoruba religious practices in the 19th century, filling each householder's ili ori. The ili ori, or house of head, is a conical container decorated with cowrie shells. By the Yoruba people of Lagos in the early 19th century, this shrine, often mistaken for a headdress, was designed to represent the human head, the ori. The Yoruba people believed that a person's character, behavior, and destiny was defined at birth by the head, making it a highly revered and respected spiritual entity. To improve one's destiny, the ili ori was honored and embellished with valuable objects and materials, which consisted of imported goods such as silk, glass beads, and cowries. Nigeria-based English writer Samuel Johnson provides us with a contemporary view of this worship practice. I quote, "The ori is the universal household deity worshipped by both sexes as the god of fate. Within the ili ori, and therefore protected from the evil eyes or elements of nature, was the ibori, or inner head." At the height of the transatlantic slave trade in the late 18th century, when millions of cowries were poured into West Africa, as many as 12,000 cowries were used to make an ili ori, and the manufacturer would have received an equal number as payment. On the death of a shrine's owner, both the ili ori and the ibori were destroyed, and the cowries were distributed among the deceased relatives, once again functioning as currency. The cowrie, like other currencies in West Africa, held both spiritual and monetary value. Due to scant evidence on visual and material culture prior to European contact in the 16th century, it is difficult to establish at what date cowries began to hold a significant value. Economic historian Marion Johnson believes that Arab caravan traders were the first to introduce the cowrie into West Africa as early as the 8th century. Since then, the cowrie has been used to symbolize power, wealth, and fertility, its round top akin to a pregnant woman's belly. Among the Yoruba, 16 cowries were used in their divination practice, the photograph on the right, to ask the Orisha spirits for advice. Conversely, in the Kingdom of Benin, some military helmets depicted on the Benin bronzes are garlanded with cowrie shells, as they were seen as protective charms, known as grease. The worship of the ori and its conceptualization as a deity began before the advent of the transatlantic slave trade. However, the widespread use of cowries in making the ili ori and irobi reveals the impact that commodities and currencies imported by Europeans had on West African cultural practices. This reveals how the meaning and value ascribed to the cowrie correlates with the increased exchange of enslaved people, connecting the cowrie and therefore the ili ori with the slave trade. Briefly, before concluding, I wanted to look at the legacies of the cowrie currency in West Africa. The abolition of the slave trade in the 19th century saw the crash of the cowrie currency. English exports from the Indian Ocean to West Africa went from an average of 68 tons in 1800 to 4.5 tons in the years 1808 to 1818, depreciating up to 80%. There was a resurgence of the currency in the 1820s, as redundant slave traders operating out of Liverpool and Bristol realized the demand for palm oil from West Africa. In Martin Lynn's words, to, I quote, "grease the wheels of the Industrial Revolution in Britain." In the 1830s, the East India Company returned to the Maldives once again to export more cowries, which was subsequently followed by other European empires. There had been a preference for the Cypria monata over other types of cowrie, one reason being their small size, until 1845, when a German ship discovered the Cypria annulus, the images on the left of the screen, which is orange ringed and larger than monata, and can be found on the shores of Zanzibar in East Africa. Despite the prejudice against annulus, exports from East Africa gradually filtered into West African economies, leading to hyperinflation, and by the end of the century, the currency's final collapse. Despite the formal end of the European involvement in the West African cowrie currency, the British continued to control local economies by establishing the West Africa Currency Board in 1912. This constituted the board in London as a currency issuer and the bank operating in West Africa as a secular currency. And obviously we've just heard from Ivana, which is so interesting about the stamps. So I wanted to include the carry stamp here as well. The carry currency, the carry continues to be visible in everyday life, with the Ghanaian Cedi coin seen on the left from the Akan word for carry, featuring the shell. And furthermore, the West African Central Bank in Benin is decorated with carries the size of windows. Although no longer recognized as a currency, the carry continues to hold symbolic and religious value, evident in works by contemporary artists. The British artist Hugh Locke has decorated a photograph of Edward Colston's statue in Bristol with objects alluding to the slave trade, including carries. Similarly, the Côte d'Ivoire designer Lafelle S. Dion, the self-proclaimed queen of carries, makes body and headdresses with carry shells to reclaim the spiritual significance of these objects, to connect with her ancestral practices, her African ancestral practices before the European colonial disruption. Thank you very much for listening.
Yeah, thank you so much, Eleanor, for that. We have to go quickly to the next presenter in today's session, who is Ruth Sachs. You can share your screen while with your bio. She is a visual artist and an academic who obtained a PhD from the Wheat Institute for Social and Economic Research in 2017. That's within the University of the Witwatersrand in South Africa. She is a member of faculty in the Visual Arts Department at the University of Johannesburg and was one of the directors of the Collaborative Arts Initiative Response Ability, located in the Joe Bath Park Greenhouse Project 2020 to 2021. Dr. Sachs has exhibited widely, locally and internationally, and our first academic book, Congo Style, is forthcoming in 2003. Ruth, you can share your screen and take the floor.
Thanks so much, and thanks for the opportunity to talk about everyday experiences in the African city together. And let's go. So I'm looking at colonial remains in the African city. So to bring in a slightly different take to the other panels. Specifically talking about two Victorian era colonial buildings whose skeletons are made with manufactured iron frames. The Jabir Park Greenhouse in Johannesburg, where I am, built in 1906, and the Hotel ABC, I'm just going to call it the ABC hotels in Mbanza and Gungu in the DRC, which I refer to as Congo, built around the same time, around probably 1906 or 1908. Both structures were foundational for the segregated colonial cities that would grow around them. I argue that they also represent the colonial ideologies of domination that brought them into being. The Jabir Park Greenhouse was erected by the British regime in South Africa. This hothouse for tropical plants was built as a whites-only green space, a botanical garden for the mining boomtown of Johannesburg, founded after the discovery of gold in the late 19th century. The Hotel ABC in the Congo and its adjacent structures marked the start of the colonial town of Tasteful, which is Mbanza and Gungu today. And you can see images, archival images of the two on the left and the right-hand side. And the Hotel ABC was erected by the Belgian colonial regime in the Congo. So what I'm going to do in the presentation that follows is I am going to demonstrate the current uses of these colonial sites. While these differ according to context, both the former hothouse and the hotel and workers' housing that goes along with them reveals that the different locations are still grappling with the everyday challenges of colonial ruination. Okay, so I'm beginning with the Johannesburg site in the colonial greenhouse. So the site of the former tropical hothouse is now a community garden known as the Greenhouse Project. And this is farmed by different growers who don't work together towards the same planting projects, but come in to plant on a patch of land if it's not being used. Individual growers tend to their own beds to farm for micro communities, like their families, and as they go. Vegetable for a site where issues of boundaries are connected to a small area. To accentuate these tensions, some growers are middle-class entrepreneurs, while others need to work in the garden for subsistence. The latter are directly tied to a longer colonial and apartheid history of inner city poor having to improvise as a means of survival. And as you can see in the archival images and in the current day images, there's sort of modernist skyscrapers surrounding this old colonial hothouse that is now an urban farm. And this is the inner city of Johannesburg. It's the Afropolitan Center today. This is the most densely populated part of Johannesburg. Africa's biggest metropolis. And so there's this green space that was created. Set up in 1906, you can see here how very different the greenhouse looks. This greenhouse was built by the British, was based on Kew Gardens, which displays various tropical vegetation that has been extracted from jungles, from land that has been taken through colonial conquest. So I argue that this hothouse in the middle of Johannesburg and the hothouse those established by the British regime across the world actually represent an array of plants laid out that deliver the natural resources of the colonies as a discrete package or product for consumption. So at the time of the establishment, the original hothouse, which is very different today, obviously, at the time it was meant as a leisure facility for whites only. It was established alongside a botanical garden that, again, people of color were only allowed in as workers, as gardeners. And that situation has flipped and changed in contemporary times since independence. However, there are still very real felt tensions. As you can see, the everyday conditions of the vegetable garden creates some visible tensions in terms of who is planting what where. Sometimes spaces go unused for a time. Sometimes they're very kind of neatly filled in with different kinds of crops. If there's any time left at the end, I can speak to the different crops that you see growing here. I include a picture of a grown area lying fallow because it has a lot of plants understood as weeds that with the colonial arrival through the establishment of botanical gardens like the one in Joubert Park actually created a hierarchy of plants that is not necessarily true to what plants are. So what's valued in a botanical garden or a hothouse is not necessarily what's useful for everyday living. So you can see some wheat here, there are blackjacks, there's amaranth, purple flower. Those are highly edible. They're edible, they're a good source of protein, both of them. And the numerous recipes that go with them, those are used by locals as a kind of emergency food, but are considered weeds in the colonial garden that's set up. Okay, so that's Johannesburg. If in Tasteful, the colonial Tasteful, current day Mbanza and Gungu, we see another Another kind of iron framework. This one was shipped from Belgium to set up hotels, just to set up, and also to set up worker housing, a little settlement, which you can see in the distance in this kind of very bucolic, ideal setting, which shipped from Belgium along the colonial railway that was established to extract natural resources from the Congo as quickly as possible. And there's a terrible history attached to the railway, that these buildings came literally with, were shipped with, then they were built, and then they housed workers that came from Europe, white workers only, and white the visitors, businessmen in the hotel. So the site itself was occupied. The villages of Nsonga and Gungu, meaning the marketplace, and villages on Tolongudi and Noki were replaced by these Victorian buildings, which obviously is not seen in the archival imagery from colonial times. It's a very fertile place, also a place of growing in a similar manner to its counterpart that I am posing from Johannesburg. Okay, and today the hotel, former hotel, is the courthouse, serving the Mbanza and Gungu region. It has been also since independence. Their independence was in 1960. Its distinctive iron exoskeleton is now painted in the bright colors of the nation's flag. With the railway line no longer in service, you can see it across from the balcony. The courthouse stands as a branch of local governance, as a national institute rather than a company hotel. Most who work in the old hotel tell of discomfort. Insufficient space and leaky walls are unpleasant factors, with the main complaint being its shabby appearance, deemed unsuitable for its august function. The sculpted grass lawns from the hotel era have long since vanished. The courthouse grounds are alive with the activities of informal traders in the process of cooking fires beneath the thatched roof. You can see that in the distance in this photo to the left. And members of the court going about their business. As you can see, this old colonial ironwork, over 100 years old, is now rusting. A lot of these areas, like this little walkway that you can see on the right, is unsafe. Okay. So over the years, nature has intervened to contradict the original claims that portable, prefabricated iron was a rational design solution to the occupation of tropical climates. Pounding temperatures, wet air and storms have left visible traces on metal. Surfaces are allied with sedimentations of moss, insects, plants, and oxidation, which layers of paint fail to completely hold at bay. While the hotel maintains its distinctive silhouette, the walls of early 20th century buildings are bent and broken. Natural forces have affected them so thoroughly that they have exposed the more permeable nature of iron. No longer inflexible, it starts to resemble something organic that decomposes. So I believe that these small details, and this is where everyday comes in, play vital roles in larger geopolitical vistas. Rusting metal and warped wooden boards not only signal everyday expediencies, the extractivist colonialism to which iron structures connect led to impoverished systems of local industry and ways of life. While their inhabitants desire serviceable offices, the structural matter of the former hotels are highly impractical for their habitation. Renovations and more permanent restoration measures are too expensive for the state. They have inhabitants to make do to get by on a day-to-day basis. The immediate grounds around the former hotels might have neat garden, but these are punctuated by piecemeal farming to keep food on the table. So here again, you can see actually quite similar crops to the ones you saw in the urban farm in the former Victorian hothouse in Johannesburg. So there's a similar use of the grounds, the site of this architecture, as subsistence farming. When speaking of the physical remnants of colonial rule and their everyday details, I follow Anne Stoller's caution against the danger of slipping into metaphor. I take her cue not to romanticize the ruins of the former Victorian hothouse and railway buildings, but treat them as a symptom and substance of history's destructive force and traces of violence left in its wake. Taking up this point, I do not present the rusting hulks of settler housing and the skeleton of the former hothouse as a symbol for a colonial system that has passed. I'm not promoting these this piecemeal farming as some kind of system of a new dawn or great new hope within a chaotic inner city. And I'm not, neither am I going for this idea of trying to illustrate the inventive agency of the ways inhabitants of Mbanza and Gungu have had to make do with what they have. I think that's fairly obvious. What I hope to draw out is the potential of these sites as complex, situated space that brings together deep, entangled histories. While I've used these sites as a signifier of the larger ruination wrought by colonial attempts at control, I have also attempted to pay keen attention to the multiple current stories that have overlaid their structures. So as the colonial systems degrade, they are not necessarily replaced or able to be replaced with something better or something new. It is the daily, seemingly inconsequential details of the site that draw out dense and diverse conglomerations of meaning. Where building materials, particularly colonial iron and plants, have been disobedient, people have had to adapt to the built and growing environment. And what I believe is that analysis based on current day experience has much to tell concerning the legacy of these buildings as representation of both the colonial industrialization processes that birthed them and the overlays of daily use that embed them in the fabric of the African city. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Ruth, for that very wonderful presentation. And thanks to all the presenters. We've had the last presentation. Now the floor is open for questions. To our audience, you can use the Q&A icon to ask your question or use the raise hand icon. I believe it should be working if you prefer to ask your question orally. And I think Janet have a question in the chat. Do you want to ask orally or you want me to read it out too? And I think that should be for Ivana, not Eleanor. Eleanor talked about cowrie. Ivana talked about the stamp. So do you want to read it?
So sorry. Yeah. Yes. Yes, my question, Ivana, so sorry about that, was I'm wondering if you do have any kind of details about the training and the educational background, and I'm sorry, I forget his name, but the artist that you talked about who designed that first stamp, because I just thought it was a really interesting example of my favorite kind of contemporary artists now who draw so well upon heritage and history and integrate it into culturally meaningful contemporary examples, which the stamps definitely were. It was a great presentation. Thank you.
Yeah,
Sorry,
absolutely.
I didn't.
Oh yeah, no, glad to be confused with Eleanor because her presentation was so great, and so were all of yours. So thank you. Great to be part of this panel. And yeah, I don't off the top of my head know exactly what his educational background is, but he certainly was, you know, in addition to being a state artist, he was the senior art master of an elite school called the Akamoda School. He was a member of the Ghana Arts Council and the Museum Monuments Board, and he was very active and involved beyond being an artist. He was also a scholar. And in 1963, he published a book called Ghana's Heritage of Culture, where he examines, you know, these questions of society and religion and virtue and iconography and color theory. And he was really interested in, you know, European art and art history and theory, but was also highly critical of it. And this book was a way for him to sort of translate Nkrumah's notions of African personality and negritude into ideas for sort of modern Ghanaian aesthetic. So he was really thinking, you know, nothing was an accident. as with all these postage designs, he was really thinking about art history and religion and culture and how to translate these into modes of expression and ideology. Kind of roundabout half answer to your question.
Yeah, thank you. There is a question in the chat by Mokolade. If you like, you can, I'm not sure if you'll be able to ask orally. You can try and let's see if it works. Otherwise, I will read it out. And Mokolade, you can go ahead and try to ask orally and let's see if it works. Are you there? Can you hear us? Yeah, apparently, I think I've just read it out. I'm not sure you will be able to ask orally. The question is for Janet. I think it says, I would like to know how reverence to the Arabic inscription came about, since the majority of the audience could not interpret it. Could it be the fear of an unknown mystery? Janet, that's for you, about the Arabic inscription on the doors.
Oh, thank you. I absolutely love this question because it's such a really interesting way to think about how these inscriptions became a part of everyday life and their long interpretation from a wide variety of audiences that saw them and engaged with them every day. So thank you. I love this question. And so my thought is all of these polities up along the Swahili coast and throughout the archipelagos developed through Muslim trade networks for centuries, going back to the 8th century at least. And so Arabic was a written language. Swahili was also a written language as that developed. And a lot of these scripts of paper that people attached to their doorways before these towns kind of developed into bigger, more cosmopolitan urban centers, a lot of the papers were written in Swahili or Arabic as primarily quotes from the Quran. So I think that's how it kind of started, mostly being written expressions of piety and protection. And then that developed as the Omani Sultanate ruled in the preceding centuries, and they were the power at the time that most of these doors were developed. They were in power. So it was an association with the ruling class and a way for people to align themselves with the Abadi sect, which the Omanis were. So I think it's a combination of who was in power at the time that a lot of these were carved, but also I do like this idea about the fear of an unknown mystery because like I said, the majority of people could not read Arabic by the time these were carved into doors. So it really just became a symbol, which for sure was associated with fear. So great question. Thank you. I hope I answered it.
Of course, thank you, Janet. I actually have a follow-up question to that. Maybe I should quickly ask that. So I was actually wondering when the first Swahili door with Arabic inscription really appeared. Was there any form of doors with a Swahili alphabet, as opposed to Arabic alphabet on them? And then what about the status of the carvers and their identities? Is that known, or how are the carvers, viewed in the society?
Oh, thank you, Tunde. Both excellent questions. And so the first question, we know, like I said, we know they use these scraps of paper, and carvers started adding text to wooden objects, but primarily doorways. We know for sure back to the 17th century, because there are examples where the door frames are absolutely covered with text. there are not a lot, as you can imagine, wood does not survive very well in this part of the world. And so there are not a lot of examples to look at, but we can look at stone or things that are carved into coral to kind of see comparatively, how are these decorations used over time. And so we know at least back to the 17th century, they were carving inscriptions into door frames and doorways and facades. And I think it developed, I haven't figured out yet. I've been trying to kind of work on a timeline of when it started to become a place at the top center lintel position. And that just became a fashion for sure in the mid to late 19th century. And that could relate to some objects that were shipped into Zanzibar by some of the wives of the Sultan. There's a door that has an inscription at that location that might have come from Shiraz. So I'm working on that kind of development of when that all happened compositionally. And what was your, the second question was a very important one about the carvers. And that is something I'm also working on. It was a chapter in my dissertation. I'm building timelines and I'm building connections between carvers of known doors and sites and trying to build portfolios for each one. And it's part of their culture to not identify their own work or indicate who carved what. But by looking at each carver's hand, we could at least assemble groups that make sense by workshop. And there are a few standout carvers that all of us, I've been taught by the carvers today. You can look at their door and you can say that was absolutely carved by so-and-so. So I've got about 7 carvers from the late 19th, earlier 20th century that I'm building kind of portfolios for. And then the current carvers from we'll say the 1960s forward, I've gone around to with their descendants or their trainees and marked who carved what door as far as we know it. So it's a long process, but it was not important to them. It was important to give the glory to God and to have it be an expression of beauty rather than personal gain. So that makes it a little bit of a challenge, but I think it's very important to try to identify them. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Janet. I still have a couple of other questions, but I will give our audience the opportunity to ask their questions. We have another question in the chat from Professor Pejula Iwola. All very interesting papers. Thank you. My question is directed at Eleanor. Do you intend to explore the religious context of cowries? That is for you, Eleanor.
Thank you. I'm not actually working on this project anymore. So sadly, I won't be able to. But yeah, that's what I found so interesting, is that there are so many different meanings for an object like the cowrie, which makes it such a fantastic object. So I think that further research definitely needs to be done, whether that's religious or monetary. Yeah, thank you.
Follow up to that actually was I was going to ask you about the valuation of cowrie shell based on the different species. Is there any evidence of how each species is kind of valued and appreciated differently in the society compared to, of course, I'm talking about both the 2 popular species. I'm not talking actually about the local cowrie, because we know that these 2 popular species are actually not present in West Africa. But of course, we can also look at those cowries that are locally available in the shorelines of West Africa. But among these 2 popular species, is there any evidence of which is more valuable and more appreciated than the other? And perhaps does that really translate to how much of that, their weight, in terms of what it can buy? Can 10 of these buy, for example, a bag of something, and only 2 of these we buy the same quality? Is there anything like that?
Yeah, it's obviously the sources are really scattered, and that's why the sort of European involvement in a way has been kind of useful from a research perspective, because obviously there are quite a lot of records of the cowries. The two popular ones, the ones I mentioned, the Cypria minata and the Cypria annulus. And the Cypria minata, as you correctly said, is pretty much only found in the Indian Ocean, which is the reason behind it getting a much bigger price, I suppose you could say, a bigger price, because it's kind of, these objects are slightly at the crossroad between being a currency, but they're also a commodity, and in the way that they're exchanged, that's a sort of, you could argue it's also a bartering process, which in itself makes it difficult to then quantify and attribute to an actual modern day value. And so there's a couple of historians who've spoken about the fact that it was in fact just used as a marker for, like, sort of like a fiat currency. It was used as a marker to equate a person, the value of a person or gold or another object. So it wasn't strictly speaking a currency. Sorry, to answer your question, the annulus wasn't worth as much. I think it's because it was coming from the East Coast, from Zanzibar, which obviously the proximity to West Africa perhaps reduced the price. And then there are records of the extraction of cowries, as you correctly say, from the coast of West Africa, and those are quite disturbing accounts, particularly from the 17th century, in which they actually used dead people, and they would float dead people out into the water and then allow the cowrie shells to feed off the flesh, and then they would haul up the bodies and take off the shells. So, I mean, yeah, there are pretty horrific accounts, but in all of that, there isn't an exact quantity, an exact number for how much they're worth in other currencies, let's say.
Yeah, thank you so much. We have a question from Rabi Yusuf for Roots. It says, very interesting and a new dimension to the study of colonial heritage. One cannot erase history for one reason or the other. The negligence management approach affects the sustainability of colonial heritage in Africa, and these have made it difficult to study. The question now, how can we reconceptualize the management approach so that a lot will be learned about it, as colonial era is part of our history and form part of our heritage? That's for Roots. I hope that is clear.
I mean, it's a great question, and I think it changes according to the locality of where the particular sort of heritage object or site is located. So yes, there's negligent management, but in cases where management kind of steps in or governance steps in, there is very often a kind of museum effect that takes place, in which buildings like the ones I've shown tend to be frozen in time. And there's a very kind of triumphant narrative that gets attached, according to how modernism came to the Congo, for example, and in South Africa as well. These old colonial buildings, the narrative that gets attached tends to be quite appraising of current governance. And I'm wondering about the topic of this conference itself, and how much, this panel itself, and how much can be gained from looking at the everyday. So when there's no archive, what do? We go and we look at the thing that's there. And I think there's a lot to be gained from that, and gleaning knowledge from the people who are using the site and what they're using it for and how they feel about it.
Yeah, thank you. There's a lot going on in the chat. Katie Kunaus just saying that if anyone is looking into cowrie, should not forget about the earlier Portuguese who brought many of the shell to West Africa. So that's something for Illinois to think of in our work on the cowrie. I think the tech are ready to kick us out in 3 minutes. I will give my colleague Vera opportunity to ask one question and then wrap up by, informing our audience about the next session tomorrow. Vera?
Thank you so much, Tunde. Yes, also from my side, thank you so much to all 4 of you for really thought-provoking, intriguing papers. I have so many questions. I have a question for each of you, but I'm a bit afraid that this will not really work out. So Tunde, what should I do? Should I say them and then we take them, let's say, because they will not have a chance to answer them, or should I just wrap up here the chair for this session? Please let me know.
If they're happy for you to email it to them, maybe there are questions that will help them, in the further, to continue their work, and then you can just give general remarks, because we have to, and you can see the time.
Exactly. Yes. For the sake of time, I would. So thank you so much for for 4 really thought-provoking papers. And my question for Ivana was with regard to possible inspirations. I was curious to hear whether some of the designers were also looking at the tradition of Ethiopian stamps, and if there was some inspiration from earlier stamps. And with regard to Janet, of course, this is such fascinating work. These amazing doors with the inscriptions. And my question was actually also a follow-up question, because I was intrigued by the way how in the urban spaces you would have these Arabic inscriptions that are not legible for everyone, but you would have women walking in kanga textiles, where, let's say, it is all about the possibility to read the proverbs and the sayings on the textiles. And I mean, these doors were in dialogue with the people who moved through these doors and who were also moving through urban space. And so it was for me intriguing to kind of think about the fact that on the one hand you have these kanga textiles with the Kiswahili inscriptions that were meant to be read, and then on the other hand you were passing through the piety doors, where it was a bit, yes, this mysterious, not being able, or only for a small minority being able to read. So this was a very fascinating aspect. And with regard to Eleanor, I also had a follow-up question, actually, following that question of Professor Layivola, because I was intrigued by the coin, where, of course, the cowrie shell, it's the currency, the former currency that is then appears as an image on currency of a coin. But I was wondering how much of the spiritual dimensions actually still remains in that image of a cowrie, or if once it's represented on a coin, if it then really is just reduced to its currency. So there I was also very much interested in this kind of spiritual realm. And with regard to Ruth, also such a fascinating topic. And now when you were speaking about the locality and where this is situated and this necessity to think about the context, I was of course thinking about Johannesburg and Cape Town and Kirstenbosch, and because Tunde and I, we are organizing a series on plants in Africa and the global south, multi-species, materialities, ecologies, and aesthetics. And we just recently heard a paper by Melanie Böhi and Fakamani Saba on contemporary approaches to kind of, decolonize Kirstenbosch and how to deal with this heritage. Particularly, I loved the point when you said plants have been disobedient. So to kind of go to the heritage and to the built environment, but also to this notion of plants that for your both presentations, because also, of course, the hotel had the gardens, etc., was so crucial. So yes, so I'm very happy that we had such a wonderful first start of this series of sessions that, as Tunde said, will continue tomorrow. We will continue tomorrow at 1 p.m. Nigerian Lagos time, and we will have 2 more sessions tomorrow, as Tunde said, and 2 more sessions on Saturday. And while we're absolutely running out of time now, but this spoke for the brilliant papers and also for the many questions from the audience. We're extremely grateful to everyone who attended. Also, a lot of our speakers for tomorrow and the day after tomorrow have been here. So we're very happy about this, and many thanks to everyone else who joined for your questions and for your participation. And while I get the point that we have to be very strict with time, we have to end now, but we are very much looking forward to continuing tomorrow. So many, many thanks again from both of us, from Tunde and me, and many thanks for today's session. Very much looking forward to the next ones. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye, everyone. See you tomorrow.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. See you tomorrow.
Bye.
Thank you.